After going through this video, you will be able to create a PHP file to fetch data from a form and store it in a table and the database as well. In this video, we will create two PHP files. In the first PHP file, we will see how we can add the data the user has entered after submitting the form to the database. And using the second PHP file, we will see how we can fetch the data from the database. To create the first PHP file, there are some prerequisites. Firstly, we need the registration form. This we have already created as an exercise in the previous topic. Next, we need a table to store the user data. If you remember, earlier in this training, in Module 4 Topic 5, we have already created a users table with the test database. We will be using the same table in this video. For the first PHP file, we will modify the register_submit.php file which you have created in the previous topic as an exercise. We will first define the four variables along with their values. A quick question. Can you tell why we need to define these variables? As you know, the first step is to establish the connection with the MySQL server, which is done using the MySQLi connect function, and this function uses these four parameters. Now, why we have entered the value of hostname as 127.0.0.1 and for the remaining variables, this is something we have already discussed in the previous video. Next, in our PHP code, we will write the SQL query that is used to establish the connection with the MySQL server. We are storing the connection reference object that MySQLi connect returns in a variable named $con. The function will return a false value if it fails to establish a connection with the MySQL server. Next, we will check using an if condition if it failed to establish the database connection. And if it fails, that is the value returned by the MySQLi connect function is false, we will print the error message using the MySQLi connect error function and exit after that. If the value returned by MySQLi connect function is true, we will first fetch the data that the user will enter in the registration form through the $post variable, which is an associative array and a superglobal variable. Here, the keys to the $post array have to be exactly the same as the names of the form elements in the registration form. Then, we will form an SQL query that will insert the data into the users table in the form of a row. We are generating a string using these user data that's a valid insert query and storing it in a variable. Insert into users, name, email, and password. These are the names of the attributes in the users table. Values. Then, user data needs to be inserted as a record into the users table. Please note the inverted commas around the variable names that store the user data. These inverted commas are needed because these fields are string or varchar and hence must be included inside the inverted commas in the query. $SQL now is a string that contains the exact SQL query we want to execute. Can you guess which function we will use next in our code? You may pause the video and refer to the communication diagram which we discussed earlier in the topic. If you have guessed the answer as MySQLi query function, then you are right. SQL queries are executed using the MySQLi query function. So, we will call this function and pass the SQL query we generated to it as a parameter. Here, we are storing the reference object that MySQLi query returns in a variable named result. Now, using an if condition, we will check if the MySQLi query function returns false, that is, if the query failed for some reason. If it does, that is, if the value returned by MySQLi function is false, we will print the error message using the MySQLi error function and exit after that. If the query is executed successfully, that is, if the value returned by MySQLi query function is true, we will write a statement that will print registration successful. At the end, we will close the MySQL connection using the MySQLi close function. Wait, I've made a mistake. I forgot to add a $sign before con in line number 8. So let me quickly add this. So this is how, using a PHP file, we can fetch user data from the submitted form and store it into a table. Before we proceed further to the next PHP file where we will see how to fetch data from the database, I would recommend you to thoroughly go through the code and its explanation, which we just discussed, as the logic for these PHP files is similar. As we have inserted the data into the table, it's now time to see how we can fetch data from a database using the MySQLi fetch assoc function. To do the same, we have the fetch _ data PHP file. If we look at the code, most of the code is same as that of the register _ submit.php file. First, we are defining the variables along with their values. Then we are using the MySQLi connect function to establish the connection. If the connection fails to establish, we will print the error message using MySQLi connect error function and exit the code. And if the connection is established successfully, we will use an SQL query that will fetch all the records from the users table. After that, we will execute the query using the MySQLi query function. If the query fails to execute, we print the error message using the MySQLi error function and exit. And if the query executes successfully, we will use the MySQLi fetch assoc function to fetch the data one row at a time. Please note that this single equal to is an assignment operator and not a comparison operator. It initializes $row with each row of the fetched data. Also, as we are using a while loop, it will continue to fetch each row till MySQLi fetch assoc function returns false, that is, there are no more rows left to be fetched. After that, inside the loop, we are simply printing the name associated with each row of the fetched data. And lastly, we will close the connection using the MySQLi close function. So when we execute this PHP file, it will print the names of all the users and will send the response to the browser, which will render and display the information to us. With this, we come to the end of this video. We created two PHP files, one file to fetch data from the submitted form and store it in the database, and the other file to fetch the data from the database and display it to the user. Up next is an exercise.